Imagine a place of absolutely stunning extremes. A place where you have the ancient ruins of once massive empires sitting in the shadow of incredibly complex modern political crises. A country with staggering natural biodiversity, yet deeply entrenched social divides. Peru isn't just another country on the map. It is absolutely central to the story of South America as a whole. So today, in this explainer, we're going to unpack it all together to understand exactly how this fascinating, sometimes puzzling country actually works.
Okay, let's dive right into this with a massive paradox because it's literally the puzzle that makes Peru so crucial to understand right off the bat. Just look at this contrast. On the one hand, Peru is an absolute agricultural powerhouse. It's a top agro exporter, and it is widely celebrated around the world as a global culinary capital. People travel there just to eat. But then flip the coin. Data from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization reveals a really heartbreaking daily reality. Over 20% of the population, that is 6.8 million people, are severely food insecure, meaning they regularly go whole days without eating. So how on earth does a country that produces such massive food wealth leave millions of its own people hungry?
Well, to solve that puzzle, we're going to explore four key themes today: geography and people, the weight of history, an economy of contrasts, and finally, democracy in crisis.
Let's start with part one, geography and people, the foundation of diversity.
To really understand Peru's wealth and its divides, we have to start with the land itself, because geography here is basically destiny. The country is essentially divided into three totally distinct zones. First, you have the arid Pacific coast to the west. This is where the political power, the modern wealth, and all that large-scale export agriculture are concentrated, especially right around the capital city of Lima. Then, running right down the middle like a spine, you have the towering Andes Mountains. This is the historic heartland of Peru's indigenous heritage, and it's the source of its massive mining wealth. Finally, out to the east lies the vast, mega-diverse Amazon rainforest, a massive tropical basin absolutely packed with natural resources. But here's the critical thing to remember. Historically, the Andes and the Amazon have faced severe marginalization compared to the coast.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how that extreme landscape, combined with centuries of migration, forged a deeply diverse, multi-ethnic society. According to the 2017 census, which, by the way, was the first time they actually asked about ethnic self-identification, over 60% of Peruvians identify as mestizo, which is a mix of indigenous and European ancestry. Nearly 26% identify as indigenous, primarily Quechua and Aymara communities in the Andes and the Amazon. You also have significant populations of white, black, and Asian Peruvians. This level of diversity is obviously a huge cultural strength, but as we'll see, those geographic and ethnic lines often overlap directly with deep socioeconomic divides. But on the positive side, you can literally taste that diversity. Lima's famous status as a global culinary capital is a direct outcome of its geography and those rich waves of immigration. You have award-winning restaurants like Central and Maido that brilliantly blend local indigenous ingredients with Spanish, African, and Asian culinary traditions. It's an amazing fusion. But looping back to our opening puzzle, we have to remember that the immense wealth generated by this booming gastronomy and the agricultural sector, it just doesn't reach everyone. And to understand why that inequality is so deeply baked in, we have to look to the past.
Which brings us to part two, the weight of history, from ancient empires to modern legacies. So, how did these unequal resource distributions actually start? Well, Peru has one of the longest histories of civilization on Earth. We are talking all the way back to the Corral Soup civilization around 10,000 BCE, the oldest in the Americas. Fast forward to the 15th century, and the Inca Empire expands, becoming the largest state in the pre-Columbian Americas. But the massive turning point? That hit in 1532, when Spanish conquistadors began their conquest. And even though Peru eventually secured its independence way later in 1824 at the Battle of Ayacucho, the brutal process of colonization created deep, structural inequalities based on race and geography that stuck around right through the internal conflicts and authoritarian rule of the late 20th century.
Let's zoom in on that colonial structure for a second. The Spanish established what was called the Viceroyalty of Peru, and they strategically centered their power on the coast in Lima. What they built was a purely extractive economy. They relied on forced indigenous labor to pull massive amounts of silver and gold out of places like Potosi and Huancavelica, all to enrich the Spanish crown. This model set up a long-lasting system that heavily favored coastal elites and Spanish descendants, while structurally marginalizing the indigenous Andean and Amazonian populations for literally hundreds of years. And those deep historical fractures, they violently erupted in the late 20th century. Peru found itself facing severe economic crises and a really brutal internal conflict with violent insurgent groups. In response, during the 1990s, President Alberto Fujimori adopted elements of a secret military project known as Plan Verde. His administration radically reshaped the Peruvian state, implementing shock therapy neoliberal economics and ruling with an authoritarian grip. Tragically, this era also included the forced sterilization of rural, Quechua-speaking women, a program that state justified at the time as a way to reduce poverty and fight subversion. Fujimori's 1993 constitution is actually still what governs Peru today, leaving a highly complex, deeply polarizing legacy that is still very much felt.
And that brings us to part 3, an economy of contrasts, macroeconomic strength versus microeconomic vulnerability.
See, while those late 20th century reforms definitely stabilized the national accounts, they ended up creating a deeply fractured dual economy. This brilliantly illustrates what I mean. On the macro level, Peru is a top global mining exporter, a proud member of the Pacific Alliance, and has these really fast-grown biotech and telecom sectors. On paper, it looks like a massive economic success story. But drop down to the micro level, the daily reality for everyday Peruvians, and it's completely different. Peru has a massive informal labor sector. It struggles with one of the lowest minimum wages in all of South America, and as we saw at the very beginning, 6.8 million people are dealing with severe food insecurity.
So why does this massive disconnect exist? Well, it's driven by several overlapping things. First, those historic regional divides between the coast and the Andes or Amazon, they are still incredibly real today. Second, you have small farmers out there bearing the absolute brunt of climate change. Third, there are massive illicit economies. We're talking drug trafficking and illegal mining that deplete the soil and fuel local violence. And beneath all of this, that lingering racial and class discrimination we talked about continues to heavily constrain social mobility for the country's most vulnerable people.
Now, you can probably guess that this level of extreme economic inequality inevitably spills over into politics. And that leads us to part 4. Democracy in crisis, institutional collapse, and endless gridlock.
The wild political gridlock we're seeing in Peru right now is actually baked directly into its legal architecture. Under that 1993 constitution, the balance of power is just severely skewed. On the executive side, you have a presidency that has been drastically weakened. Why? Because the Constitution uses these very broad, vague terms that allow Congress to impeach the president basically without a concrete cause. Then, on the legislative side, you have a unicameral Congress, meaning just one chamber, that has learned exactly how to weaponize those impeachment rules to assert almost absolute control over the government. So, the absolutely crucial point here is this staggering number, 8. That is the number of presidents Peru has cycled through in just the last 10 years, between 2016 and 2026. 8 presidents in a single decade. It's wild. It perfectly illustrates an environment of severe, unending democratic instability where trying to make any long-term policy becomes pretty much impossible. And compounding this structural flaw is an absolute epidemic of corruption among recent Peruvian leaders. Just look at this list. Alberto Fujimori, imprisoned for human rights violations and corruption. Alan Garcia, who tragically took his own life as police arrived to arrest him over the massive Odebrecht bribery scandal. Alejandro Toledo, Ollanta Humala, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, Martin Vizcarra, literally every single one of them entangled in massive corruption or bribery investigations. This endless cycle just completely destroys public trust, and it frequently sparks massive and sometimes deadly social protests across the country. And while the presidency has been a revolving door, Congress has been busy. This instability has allowed a really concerning trend to accelerate: legislative aggrandizement. In February 2023, a ruling by the Constitutional Court, and it's worth noting the members of that court are actually elected by Congress, removed judicial oversight of the legislative body. By capitalizing on all those protests and endless presidential impeachments, Congress has effectively consolidated absolute control over the Peruvian state. Let's move to the final piece and see how this all builds together. Peru's path forward, reconciling the paradox. So what does this all mean? As we've seen throughout this explainer, Peru is quite literally a country of abundant wealth. It has spectacular biodiversity and an incredibly rich, resilient culture, but its institutions are paralyzed by centuries of historical divides and very modern corruption. So the ultimate question is this: can Peru reform its broken political system to finally distribute the immense wealth of its land to all of its people? Or will the paradox of a hungry population living in a land of plenty just continue? It's a critical question, and honestly, it's one that matters not just for Peru, but for democracies everywhere.